Hey everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Seriously Risky Business podcast. My name's Patrick Gray. In these podcasts, we speak with our colleague, Tom Uren, about the work that he does with us, which is the Seriously Risky Business newsletter, which goes out every Thursday here in Australia. You can subscribe to that one by heading over to news.risky.biz. And this work that Tom does with us is supported by Lawfare and the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, so big thanks to them. And we've also got a sponsor for this week's podcast, which is Stairwell. And what Stairwell does is it can go and collect every single sort of executable and script and whatever in your environment. Once you've got that corpus of files in one place, you can do all sorts of really cool analysis, like figuring out where and when malware was in your environment. You can build timelines, you can find variants. It's extremely cool stuff. You can find them at stairwell.com. And Tom, we're going to be talking about a few things this week. Kind of a slow news week, which is to be expected because it's Thanksgiving week in the United States. But we got this story to talk about. We went through it yesterday on the regular Risky Biz podcast, but you've done some additional reporting here. The Australian government is going to pass a new act of legislation just to make sure that evidence collected in the Anom sting is going to stand up in court. So this was, of course, the joint FBI and AFP operation. I think the Europeans were involved as well, where they were selling crime phones to people and they thought they were getting secure devices, but they happened to carbon copy every message sent over the network onto a device, onto a server that was controlled by authorities. So that was a treasure trove of evidence. In Australia, several hundred people have been arrested, 392 offenders have been charged in relation to this operation. 6.6 tons of drugs and about 55 million in cash have been seized. So obviously, this is a bunch of prosecutions. The government wants to succeed, but passing an act of parliament to shut down an avenue of appeal is somewhat controversial. So what you've done is you've gone and spoken to a special counsel and a King's Counsel about this. Tell me what they said, because we are but mere cyber nerds. These people are actually lawyers and very good ones. What did they have to say about all of this?
Yeah, so I spoke to Greg Barnes of the Australian Lawyers Alliance and also Michael Whitten, who's a King's Counsel, and both of them agree this is very unusual. This doesn't happen often. There have been cases in the past, like maybe 20, 30 years ago in Victoria, where something similar has sort of happened. And with these kinds of actions, the concern is that if you're in a totally authoritarian state, or even just, moderately authoritarian one, parliamentarians can go around changing laws to make people they don't like end up in prison for something that wasn't a crime before. So that, if it was that would be very much on the nose. And that was kind of the perspective that Greg Barnes was taking. Governments should not be in the business of passing retrospective legislation that undermines the rights of an accused person.
I mean, I just think one thing that's, kind of mitigates that as a concern a little bit is that this has bipartisan support. Yeah. So this isn't just one side of government doing this. Like, everybody agrees that everybody in the parliament agrees that this should happen.
Yeah, so in the parliament, I want to say even the Greens. So that sounds a bit pejorative, but the Greens senator stood up. I'm not sure if it was a senator, but in the reading of the bill, and said, "Look, we haven't had much time to look at this, but fine." His complaint
the Greens,
was more
the reason you say that is a lot of people watching this wouldn't necessarily know, but the Australian Greens tend to oppose anything related to, surveillance or, this sort of stuff. So for the Greens to support it, it really means that everyone's kind of all aboard the let's convict these guys train.
Yeah. And so Michael Whitten, when I spoke to him, he had a different perspective, which was kind of the more big picture perspective that, yes, we have an independent judiciary and court system, and they're meant to interpret the laws. But it is up to the parliament to make the laws. And so it's their job, in a sense, to make sure that the laws are being interpreted, or the laws are being changed to make sure that the interpretation is what Parliament wants.
Yes.
So usually what would happen is you would write a law, it works its way through the court system, someone appeals, there's some wrinkle or problem or from the perspective of the Parliament, misinterpretation that results in decisions that aren't what Parliament intended. So then, if it's important enough, Parliament will go back and redraft the law and change it and amend it or whatever. So in this case, the ANOM sting is such an unprecedented operation. So many potential offenders or alleged offenders, whatever the correct term is, that to me at least, it feels like Parliament has gone, oh, this is a bit risky. We don't want all these potential convictions to disappear because the way we want the law to be interpreted is not what's happened in the courts.
Well, and it is clear that it was looking like that was an avenue of appeal, which is lawyers were going to argue, this surely isn't what the Parliament intended when it passed this act. And, what the Parliament's doing is passing an act saying, yes, it was.
yeah, basically. It's saying, that was all fine. It's quite extraordinary in that it says these specific warrants issued at this specific time for this specific thing, they're all good.
Yeah.
and everything related to them is good.
Essentially what they're saying is, the Parliament intended for warrants like these to be issued, right? And for these sort of instances. And I think it is... Yeah, it's just a very interesting development because what you've got is a set of offenders, right, in these cases who have a lot of money. So they have access to lawyers. So we're talking about, a big organised crime nexus. They can afford the good lawyers, right? Yeah. So you can tell that what's happened is they've been shoveling money at lawyers, and this is what they've sort of come up with, which could be an avenue of appeal. Quite often they don't even expect to win these appeals, but what they want to do is sort of drag it out for as many years as possible, and this just all shuts it down. I am sympathetic to the, Greg Barnes, the special counsel who you quoted in your newsletter here. He said that governments should not be in the business of passing retrospective legislation that undermines the rights of an accused person. I don't really know that that's what they're doing here, if I'm honest.
I think it's really important that this has actually been decided within South Australia. So one of the Australian states, it was, litigated. It went to the Court of Appeal, and in both decisions they said what the police did was fine. So it's not that there was... So at this point in time, nothing
There's
unlawful
been no
has
successful
happened.
appeal. Yeah, exactly.
And so
right?
it's just heading off. In Australia, there's another court above that, Australia's High Court. And so it's just heading off the possibility that there might be a successful challenge at that top.
Well, and I'm guessing successful challenges in other states as well, right? So,
so the decisions are really interesting because it goes into, when exactly is something part of the telecommunication system? Is when you press send, and it goes into minutiae, and each of the decisions is slightly different. So there is the possibility that someone could come along later and make a different decision again. One court said, the app on a phone is not part of the telecommunications system. And another decision is how can you separate a phone from the
I went into this yesterday on the show, and it is quite funny, right? Because for getting a telecommunications interception warrant, I believe you need to be... There's a whole bunch of criteria. I believe you need to be investigating a specific offence, which in this case they weren't. This started as an intelligence gathering operation, so they didn't know what the messages were going to say, and they didn't know which crimes they were going to reveal, which, as far as I know, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm pretty sure that rules out a telecommunications interception warrant right there. And then you have to demonstrate principles like exhaustion, which is there's no other way to collect the evidence, so on and so forth. So what they did is they designed a system that would carbon copy the messages onto a server controlled by the government, and then they essentially got a computer access warrant, which is more akin to a search warrant, to retrieve the information from that server, which is a cute way, I will admit, Tom, is a pretty cute way of arguing that it wasn't a telecommunication, right? Because it was stored data just sitting on this server that they happen to be using a system designed by authorities that would store the data on those systems. But I think, and you and I have talked about this in other cases as well, Australian lawmakers tend to be somewhat pragmatic when it comes to stuff like this. And, they don't entertain this sort of nonsense. And, here is a great example of that.
Yeah, I think it is a classic example of something that is just, I think it's really driven by how important that sting operation was. If it was just one person or one crime gang, I think it would, we'll wait for the decision. In a way, that would be better if the decision was favourable, because then it's settled, everyone can move on. I think this leaves open the possibility that I think they must go back and revisit the legislation to sort of eliminate the possibility in the future and make it clear exactly where those boundaries are.
Yeah, perhaps. But I guess we'll talk about that when that happens. You've got a couple other items in the newsletter this week that are interesting. You've got a Red Team assessment report published by CISA, which I think is really interesting because they have gone after a US critical infrastructure organization, then they published the report. What was interesting here is they didn't gain access via phishing, which is usually, just a ironclad guaranteed way to get some sort of initial foothold in an organization. So that's great news. But then they managed to access the organization because a previous set of Red Team has left behind a web shell on a box somewhere, and that is just so sloppy. Like, I've seen Red Team contracts and they say you got to clean up. You cannot introduce vulnerabilities like this into a customer environment. So someone really screwed up their job by not tidying up. But I think the moral of what you've written here isn't so much the specifics of this report. It's more that it's good that CISA's doing this sort of thing and publishing these sort of findings, and you're supportive of it.
Yeah, that's right. They do a good job. They're comprehensive. They've got a good scope and timeline. So some of these reports I've written about before, they run over a couple of months. So it feels like a very realistic, operation where they can actually say something constructive about what you should do.
And another short item we got this week, and I guess we can kind of combine this with some late breaking news. So something that just landed on our desks this morning is the FTC is launching a probe against Microsoft. That's going to cover off their licensing practices, their cloud computing business, their cybersecurity offerings, and AI products. And, an FTC probe like that, it's going to hurt, right? Like, even if they come out the other side of it smelling shiny, which I doubt they will, it's going to hurt. So this is actually a phenomenally big deal.
Yeah.
But, prior to that...
The questions that they've been sent run to hundreds of pages. So
yes,
that's a lot of stuff.
Yeah. No, an FTC probe is not an enjoyable experience, right? You talk to anyone who's lived through that, and it's just it's going to drag out for years and be a lot of work. But you've also written about how Brad Smith, who's Microsoft's vice chair and president, told the Financial Times that he's urging Trump to do more on cyber because of these cyber attacks that we're seeing today, state-backed attacks. It's totally unacceptable. So he's urging Trump to do more. There's some irony here, which is perhaps Trump might be inaugurated and tell Brad Smith, hey, we want you to do more.
Yeah.
Given that so many of these major incidents are tied back to security deficiencies in Microsoft's products. So, I mean, you can understand why you would have words for an incoming administration, but at the same time, you do read this and roll your eyes a little.
Many times I've criticized Smith's messages or writing because they seem a bit naive to me about just what states can do, are willing to do, and will do, and what influence they can have. And I'm not sure if it's naivety or trying to blame shift. It's not our problem. It's the other. It's not our security that's the problem. It's that other states want to attack our security that's the problem.
Honestly, I can't work him out. I don't have a good read on Brad Smith because I just sort of think, to a degree, maybe he's a bit of a Microsoft cultist and he actually believes everything that he's saying. But there's that part of me as well where I think, well, is this distraction? Is this distraction, or is he just such a Microsoft cultist that, that he believes absolutely everything he's saying here? And I don't know.
I mean, I try and take people at face value. I think he does believe it. But like I'm uncertain about that. That's what I think. But just so the things he talks about are cyber espionage and destructive attacks from states, basically nation-state operations. And there's just no way that you can do something, that the US can do something that will in any way significantly deter these operations. Like, they have an internal logic of their own that nothing the US can do will stop them. And if you were to propose something that would stop them, everyone would think that you're crazy. Like, the sort of bar for response would be so high that it's just a non-starter, which is just a long way of saying that there's nothing you can do. Nothing you can practically or realistically do, I should say.
Yeah, and I think that your assessment here, here's what you've written. Trump doesn't care about cybersecurity as an independent topic, but instead focuses on bigger issues such as competition with China. And that's right, as he should, because when it comes to state competition, cyber operations are a means to an end, not an end in themselves. So cyber is secondary in the scheme of real-world geopolitics. And I think that those are wise words, Tom, and words that many people in this discipline tend to forget.
Yeah, I mean, it's natural that we forget it. We care about it as a topic. We think it's underappreciated, which I think it probably is. But at the same time, we've got to have a sense of perspective. I mean, I said it better than I wrote it better than I said it. It's a means to an end, not an end in itself.
Yeah. All right, Tom. Well, anyone who's interested in reading your terrific newsletter, there's a bunch of other stuff in there as well that people will be able to read through. Just head over to news.risky.biz and subscribe, and you can get Tom's newsletter every week, and also 3 bulletins from our colleague, Mr. Catalin Kimpanu, who covers more news-related topics. But, mate, that's it for this edition of the podcast. Thank you so much for joining me, and we'll do it all again next week.
Thanks, Matt.